Oh my God. Well, thank you all. It's great to be here. Thank you for coming out. And I want to thank Helen and Charles and all the dedicated people that organized this conference. It's been great so far. I've really enjoyed some of the talks. I haven't seen everything, but what I've seen is pretty rich stuff. So I'm honored and pleased to be here, back in Portland after I don't know how long. I think the last time was the herb stomp. Yeah, okay. And also I wanted to thank Dr. Garcia Romeo, however, for giving us the latest state-of-the-art on the research on psilocybin and all the other speakers. But thank you. I'm glad that he was the last next to me. As you can see, there's a lot going on in the world of psilocybin, and I thank him for mentioning the Hefter Research Institute, so I don't have to so much. It's the little institute that nobody even knows what it stands for. We don't have good publicists like MAPS, but anyway, we're doing good work, or the people we're supporting are doing good work. So check out the hefter.org if you have a chance. So I'm going to shift the focus a little bit away from the therapeutic applications of psychedelics, and it's not even exclusively about psychedelics. It's about plants, it's about psychoactive plants. The genesis of this talk and this project, it's called the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. And it's a conference that I helped organize last summer in the UK at a beautiful place called Tyringham Hall in Buckinghamshire. And it's the realization of something I've wanted to do for a long time. Because there was originally a conference that was put on in San Francisco in 1967, sponsored by, of all people, or of all institutions, the National Institute of Mental Health. So your tax dollars, probably not yours, because none of you were born yet, but our tax dollars as American citizens went to this conference, which was held in San Francisco in the '67, the Summer of Love, but it was definitely underground, or it was in the background. It was a private conference, and the only thing that ever came out of it was the symposium volume by the same name, the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. The original program or idea was that there would be follow-up conferences every 10 years or so. Well, the war on drugs came along, psychoactive drugs became stigmatized, the US government became embarrassed that they ever had anything to do with sponsoring such a conference, so it never happened. In the 50 years that have passed since, there's actually been a lot of research in ethnopharmacology. And so I wanted to do a conference that would follow this up somewhat and look at the past, look at what's been discovered, also look at what the future of ethnopharmacology might hold. So that's what this talk is about. And one of the original participants in the 1967 conference is a man named Dr. Stephen Zara, a Hungarian psychiatrist and chemist, and he is still going strong at the age 95. And the reason we dedicated the conference to him, I wanted to do that because Dr. Zara is very poorly known in the history of psychopharmacology, but he is the person who originally definitively demonstrated that DMT was a psychedelic. And he did it in the only way possible. He did it by careful self-experiments. Maybe not all that careful. The backstory is that he was a researcher in Hungary. He wanted to work with LSD, which was not illegal at that time. This was like 1955. He applied to Sandoz for a supply of LSD so he could pursue his psychiatric research. They replied that because he was behind the Iron Curtain, they were not going to give him a supply to work with. So he basically decided, well, you know, screw you, I'm a chemist. So he made his own supply of dimethyltryptamine, and he injected it into himself over a number of occasions and demonstrated that it was indeed a potent psychedelic. So this is, you know, and I of course invited him to the 2017 conference, but he's 95, right? So he doesn't go anywhere. He is completely cognitively functional though, and he very kindly submitted a video, so he was a video guest, and which I have here. I'm not going to play it because you can watch it online, and in fact I should mention all of the lectures for this conference were live streamed on Facebook. So if you go to espd50.com, you can click a button and go to a site that has all those videos. Interesting story with Dr. Zara, who later came to the United States and spent a few years, ironically and sort of justifiably, as the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. So, you know, they were a little more progressive in those days, but but he gave a video, and also after the '67 conference he was there, he asked his supervisor, what's going on over in Haight-Ashbury? Who are these hippies? What's going on? And his supervisor said, well, you know, Steve, you ought to go over there and have a look. And so he did. He went over to Haight-Ashbury and he hung around for a couple of weeks and talked to the hippies and observed what was going on as a psychiatrist and a, you know, sort of anthropologist. And he wrote a report for the National Institute of Mental Health at that time. That's what he was associated with. He wrote a report, and his supervisor looked at it and said, we're not going to publish this. And so he stuck it in a drawer, and there it remained for 50 years. When I organized this conference, I asked him to submit that as his publication, which he did. He submitted the prohibited, censored publication that NIH wouldn't let him publish. It's called, because he said, look, I'm 95, what the hell do I care? Right. So he submitted it, and it's one of the best papers in this symposium. We published all this as a symposium volume. We republished the '67 volume and as a high-resolution new reprinting, and the 2017 volume. That's what you see on the book table. It was originally planned to be a limited edition, a collector's edition. We printed 1,000 copies, figuring, and helped, we pre-sold them, and that helped pay for the publication. We figured there was no way that we were going to sell more than 1,000 copies. A year later, I went on Joe Rogan and mentioned this. All the existing stock sold out within 48 hours. We're now on our third printing of 1,500 copies. And if you want to buy it for someone you love for Christmas, it should be ready for Christmas. Go to Synergetic Press and you can buy it, or you can buy it out there. Anyway, so that is the backstory of this conference. And it was, I should also mention, as I did, that it was Facebook, it was live streamed on Facebook. Those videos are up there, and at some points during this 4-day conference, over 70,000 people were watching these live streams. So apparently there's a great deal of interest in this sort of dead discipline, which is anything but dead. And that was impressive. So now a lot more people in the world know what ethnopharmacology means. I won't bother asking you if you know what it means. I assume you know what it means. And there are actually a bunch of different definitions. So it was fun to do this conference. This was something I wanted to do for a long time.
My name is Steve Zara. Greetings to Dr. Dennis McKenna and to all the
I'm not going to let Stephen, it's about 3 minutes long, but you can see he's pretty functional. Okay, so let's go back to 95. So the DMT obviously didn't do him any harm. Well, I became aware of this conference in 1968, the first conference, and I was a bored teenager living in a small town in western Colorado called Paonia, hanging out with my friends who were also bored, and we spent some time. We spent a lot of time smoking a little dope when we could get it, which was not often, drinking copious amounts of beer, which was much easier to get, singing protest songs, and just being disgruntled 18-year-olds, wanting to be anywhere but Paonia, Colorado, which we regarded as the armpit of the universe. Actually, it's a pretty nice town, but it wasn't so in those days. Where we really wanted to be was here in San Francisco during the Summer of Love, 1967. Well, a couple of us got to go there, spent 2 or 3 weeks in the Haight-Ashbury and Berkeley, because my brother was going to school in Berkeley at that time. So we did get in on some of this, and anyway, we did get to. Why my father decided to let me go to San Francisco in 1967, I have no idea, because he had to know that, we were up to no good. But he did, and that impacted me. And it was about that time that 2 books came into my life. One of them was The Teachings of Don Juan. Over there, the first edition, my brother gave me a copy of that for my 18th birthday. The other one was the first volume, the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. Very dog-eared, beaten-up copy. I don't know where it came from, but somehow it fell into my hands. And these 2 books were very influential. The Teachings of Don Juan made me aware of the ethnographic background of psychedelics, because in the larger society, we knew about Timothy Leary, and Timothy Leary was not exactly tapped into, thousands of year old indigenous traditions. One of the big problems with psychedelics at that time was nobody knew what to do with these things. There was no knowledge base about how to use them, and the indigenous traditions were largely unknown or ignored. So the Teachings of Don Juan, even though much of it is inaccurate, to say the least, but it made clear to me that there is an ethnographic tradition, and so I could relate to that. And then I realized that's where you have to look if you want to understand psychedelics. Talk not to Timothy Leary, not even to the psychiatrists that were using it, talk to the people that have used it for thousands of years, and you can learn something. The other one was the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs, and that was the other side of the coin. That's where I realized not only is there an ethnographic aspect to this, there's a scientific aspect too. And some of the people who in life, as I developed my career, are Richard Schultes, Andrew Weil, Sasha Shulgin, all of those people were at this original conference. And that was really when I became aware of them. And I realized there's a scientific aspect to this. There's actual science behind the study of these psychoactive plants. And I was sort of searching around for, what career direction am I going to go? And, in my sort of 18-year-old naive brain, I thought, wow, I can actually get paid to get stoned. And there's a little more than that, but I decided ethnopharmacologic ethnopharmacology was a worthy career direction, and so I sort of headed that direction. And then 17 years later, we were able to publish this beautiful book and have this conference, and I helped organize it, but I had many people helping, including Wade Davis, who's an editor on the book, Ian Prance, who was formerly the director of Kew Gardens, and Ben DeLeonen, who is now the president and founder of ICERS, if you know ICERS. How many of you know ICERS? Not very many. Check it out, ICEERS on the web. It's the International Center for Ethnobotanical Education, Research, and Service, and they are doing the most effective work in the preservation of ayahuasca and ibogaine and addressing a lot of the legal issues and other issues. A fine organization, and Ben is a close friend and a really fine person. Well, as some of you may know, the genesis of all this happened in 1971. I mean, we were intensely interested in psychedelics, of course, by this time. 1971 rolled around, and for various reasons, which I won't go into, we quit our jobs. We didn't really have jobs, so that was easy. I was a student, my brother was a student, more or less, and we were fascinated by DMT and what we had read about it, and we heard about an orally active form of DMT. And we thought, wow, that's interesting, because one of the frustrations of DMT, if any of you have taken it, is it's very short. It only lasts about 10 or 15 minutes. And you can't do much with that. All you can do is sort of be astonished and say, what the hell was that? But you're not bringing back a lot of noetic contact. So we thought, well, maybe if we could spend more time in this dimension, and we really thought of it as a dimension, we can learn more and understand what this altered state was about. I mean, it seemed much more interesting to us than any of the psychedelics, LSD and mescaline, that were around at that time. So we heard about this orally active form of DMT in a paper by Schultes, and it was used by the Witoto Indians, the Witoto indigenous group in southern Colombia, in a small place called La Chorrera. And so we decided, okay, this is the secret. We thought of it as the secret, and we decided we have to go after this thing. So that's what put us here in the pasture at La Chorrera in 1971. We were on our quest to find the secret. Well, as it turned out, this was the real secret. And these, because it was a pasture, and because there were cattle everywhere, and because cattle produce dung that happens to be the preferred substrate for the pan-tropical psilocybin mushroom, Psilocybe cubensis, and it was the rainy season, there were big, beautiful clusters of psilocybin mushrooms growing out of practically every cow pie. And so we knew what they were, and we were very cavalier in our attitude toward them, because we were looking for this obscure Witoto thing derived from Varroa species, and eventually we found it. That's another story. And when we finally located this, which was called ukuhe, it turned out not to be very exciting. But when we got to La Chorrera, these mushrooms were everywhere, and we thought, well, we can have fun with these while we're waiting for the real secret to show up. And there wasn't a whole lot to eat at that time there. I mean, so we started eating them rather regularly, and in fairly copious quantities, and you'd be surprised they make a good omelet. They're not bad in mushroom soup. They're not that bad, really. I mean, they have a little bit of a bitter tang to them, but we ate them, and the mushrooms quickly reorganized our priorities and made us understand that this is where the real secret is. And so I'm not going to go too far into that today because we never get out of here. If you want to read the whole story, you can read my brother's book, True Hallucinations, or my book, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, which is out there. And that unpacks the experiment at La Chorrera in fairly great detail. And actually, my book is the real story. He made his. Read them both, and you decide. Right? So anyway, if anything important came out of that misadventure, I think of it, this is one of the things. We brought back the psilocybin spores, the mushroom spores, with us, and over the next couple of years, we worked with them and figured out how to grow them. And part of the reason was that, basically the crazy things that happened to us, we wanted validation. We wanted other people to have access to these experiences so they could confirm that, yeah, this was a very weird dimension of human experience, or that we were totally nuts, and it was only us that was having these experiences. Well, as you who are experienced with mushrooms probably know, it was the former. It opens up the portals to some very, very interesting altered states. And my brother famously said, we're involved in a symbiotic relationship with something that has disguised itself as an alien invasion so as not to alarm us. And there's some truth to that. So anyway, that had an impact on society in the sense that it put this non-toxic, easily produced psychedelic in the hands of, just about every creative 10th grader that got their hands on this. And it's been the subject of many a science fair project, in the early 70s. And so in that way, the mushroom did in fact invade society very quietly and subtly and totally successfully without a shot being fired. So that's a good thing. Here's what we thought we were looking for when we originally went to La Chorrera. It was a drug medicine derived from Varrola, which is a genus of trees in the nutmeg family. In other parts of the Amazon, the sap of Varrola is very rich in DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT, and various tribes, such as the Yanomami, extract the sap, and they make a powder out of it, and they use it as snuff, as is shown there at the bottom. And and they use it as a snuff because, as many of you know, these tryptamines are inactive if taken orally. And the reason they're inactive if taken orally is because they're destroyed by enzymes in the gut, monoamine oxidases. So if you take a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, such as found in ayahuasca, then it becomes orally active. And this was not ayahuasca, and we didn't know anything about MAO inhibitors at that time, or that might be in there. But it was reported as an orally active DMT-containing psychedelic. It was also a dying tradition. We went to La Chorrera, which was the ancestral home of the Witoto. And what we found was that they'd largely forgotten about this. Some of the people there remembered that this was something their fathers, their grandfathers used to do. It was a very impacted society due to the atrocities that had been committed during the rubber boom. But there were some people there who, remembered that this was part of their shamanic tradition. And some were willing to, give it a try to prepare it for us. And we collected it, and after an extensive process of cooking and concentration, mixing with ashes and so on, the final product looked something like this. And you took maybe a third of this sort of bolus, and it had a very dramatic and quick effect. Not particularly psychedelic and not particularly pleasant. We got about 7 of these different samples from different practitioners. We tested them all in the field, like good ethnopharmacologist should. And actually only 2 or 3 of the 7 or so that we collected had any activity at all. And this particular one, when I got it back to the lab in British Columbia, I was a graduate student at the University of, at UBC at that time. This was 10 years after La Chorrera. And I bioassayed this one in the field, and I said, this is a lot like 5-methoxy-DMT. What limited experience I had of it at that time. And so when I got this back to the lab and could actually put it through the HPLC and all that analysis, it turned out exactly right. It had basically very high amounts of one alkaloid, 5-methoxy-DMT, and it was definitely orally active. So this is the gentleman that produced this for us, Don Marcos, who is actually not a Witoto. He was a Bora, very closely related tribe, and he remembered how this was made, and so we were able to get the sample and document how he made it. So, and then this became 1/2 of my doctoral thesis at UBC. The other half was ayahuasca. I was interested actually in comparing these two because both orally active tryptamine-based psychedelics, completely different botanical sources, but similar pharmacology, or so we thought. So that was kind of the rationale. And the gentleman that was my informant for the ayahuasca part of the work was a shaman from Pucallpa named Don Fidel Mosambite, and we connected with him and his uncle, Don Jose. And it turns out that it was a lucky find because he was, number one, extremely knowledgeable about ayahuasca and how to use it and how to prepare it, and also happy to show us how to do that. And we could photograph that and collect samples, bring those back for later analysis. So he wasn't a scientist, he was a shaman, but he understood the importance of looking at the constituents of his preparations, which we did. And eventually I got it back to UBC and spent the next 3 years working on this project in Neil Tower's lab in the Department of Botany. He was a well-known ethnopharmacologist, I guess you could say, or phytochemist. And like all good graduate students, eventually you publish a paper about this. So I published 2 papers more or less simultaneously. One was called Monoamine Oxidase Inhibitors in South American Hallucinogenic Plants, Tryptamine and Beta-Carboline Constituents of Ayahuasca. The other one was Constituents of Orally Active Myristicaceous Hallucinogens, in other words, the Varolas, which are in the nutmeg family, in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology. So those were my first two publications that came out of this work. At the same time, my friend Luis Eduardo Luna, who I still work with and is probably the world's expert on the ethnography of ayahuasca, was in Iquitos studying that with his informant, shown here, Don Emilio Andrade, who is part of this, what I kind of call the old school of vegetalismo, as the tradition is called in the Amazon, and also turned out to be an extremely valuable informant. You know, there's often a perception that these people, you know, want to keep their knowledge secret, they don't want to share it. That has not been our experience. Mostly, they're delighted and surprised if you go to them and say, I'm interested in what you know. Nobody's ever asked them that, you know, and a lot of time they're not even respected in their culture, especially by younger people. You know, I mean, what's this old guy in the corner? What does he know? He's just drooling in his oatmeal. These guys know things, and they were happy that, you know, young people like Eduardo and myself were coming and asking for what they know with great respect. And so it was very gratifying. Well, in 1986, I finished my degree in 1984. In 1986, I got in 19 86, that's right. I got a postdoc at NIH, working under Dr. Juan Saavedra. And he was in the laboratory of clinical pharmacology, so it's sort of what goes around comes around, because this was the institution that had sponsored the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. And I spent a couple of years there, very productive years in some way, very frustrating years in other ways. But about 2 weeks after I'd gotten there, Dr. Saavedra said, there's some old chemicals that Julie Axelrod was his supervisor in the same lab. Eventually, Julius Axelrod won the Nobel Prize for his work on neurotransmission. And he and Saavedra had published the first papers on the endogenous occurrence of DMT, which is why I was there. I wanted to study that. I ended up studying something completely different. But Juan said, there's a box of old standards that Julie and I were working with up on the shelf, and you should check it out. If there's anything useful, keep it, and send the rest to the hazardous waste disposal at the NIH. So I got up on the laboratory desk after everybody had gone home. I took down this box, and right beside the box was a mint condition, unopened, untouched copy of the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. So it was like magic, because the one in 68 had got me started, and then this amazing serendipitous discovery. Well, needless to say, both that book and some of the interesting standards that were in that box quietly disappeared into, my private library. And there were some very interesting compounds, some tryptamine derivatives that I don't think ever existed anywhere else. So that was useful and interesting, and just kind of one of those synchronistic things that happens. Okay, in 1991, flash forward again, I finished that postdoc, and I was working actually at this time for Shaman Pharmaceuticals, which was a startup pharmaceutical company in the Bay Area that was ethnobotany-driven drug discovery. That was the idea. They'd hired me as the director of ethnopharmacology for whatever that meant, but during this time, I was invited, along with a number of investigators, by the UDV, one of the Brazilian religions that uses ayahuasca as a sacrament in religious ceremonies, not really as a medicine. But they invited myself and a number of researchers in this field at the time to come to Sao Paulo for a conference. And the conference was put on by the medical division of the UDV. And the political agenda was that the regulatory body in Brazil at that time, CONFEN, was thinking about banning ayahuasca. And so they wanted some outside investigators to come in and do a biomedical investigation. And they thought that outside investigators would carry somehow more credibility, although there were very, competent physicians and so on there. So they held this conference, and they kind of revealed this was the hidden agenda. This was the real agenda of this conference. One of the conversations that happened in the corridors, not on the stage. And so we said, yes, we'd love to do this. So I went back and I started working on a grant. I had a grant in process that I was hoping to submit to NIDA at the time, and then I sort of put it on the shelf because I realized no way is NIDA ever going to fund this grant. But I went back after this conference and I dusted it off, and we were able to get some funds from a couple of very generous donors, one of whom is Robert Barnhart, who is still associated with the Hefter and is on our board, and the other one's last name was Rockefeller. So we got about 75 grand to do this study, which was a very small amount. We returned to the Brazilian Amazon in 1993 to the original temple of the religion called the nucleocalpari. They call them nucleos. They're like a parish in a church. They have temples in various parts of Brazil, but this was the first one. And first of all, we had to do a preparo, what they call a preparo, which is to produce ayahuasca on a fairly industrial scale. These folks have to make enough ayahuasca to serve 10,000 people every 2 weeks. And so they know how to crank it out, right? And they did, and now it's about twice that amount. They grow all their ayahuasca. There's no environmental impact. They grow it all. So we did a preparo, which is shown here, and then we just set up shop in the temple, and we measured various parameters. We did the usual. We looked at all the blood pressure, pupillary dilation, and those sorts of things, heart function, but we also did pharmacokinetics, and we took platelets. And platelets could be used as a sort of external measure of changes in receptor profiles, up and down regulation in the central nervous system. So we carried this out. And we also conducted in-depth psychiatric interviews with all of the subjects, with a Brazilian psychiatrist, and then Charlie Grobe, who's again still with the Hefter Institute, administering the questions with the help of a Brazilian psychiatrist who spoke Portuguese. So we did these psychiatric profiles. And we found that there was no evidence from our results of, there was no evidence of any acute toxicity, any evidence of any neurological or cognitive or personality dysfunctions in long-term users. We actually had a group of controls that we were comparing for things like cognition, verbal ability, that sort of thing, and the drinkers of ayahuasca were slightly but significantly more competent at that than the age-matched controls. And there was strong evidence of positive behavioral changes. The stories that they told us in these interviews was that most of the folks that in our sample had fairly dysfunctional lives until they joined the UDV. Alcoholism, domestic violence, a lot of criminality, and basically their lives were in crisis. They usually came to the UDV hoping for some kind of healing. Usually a friend would invite them. They almost all narrated that their initial experiences with ayahuasca were terrifying, but also redemptive. They could see where they were going in their life path, and they had a revelation. If they don't change direction, it's headed in a bad direction. And so they made those changes, and they all said, as long as I take the medicine, as long as I stay in the UDV, which they understood to be a very supportive community, which it is, I'm okay. And many of these people had been taking ayahuasca on average of every 2 weeks, some as long as 40 years. Everyone in the study had taken it for at least 10 years, and it stuck, I mean, they were well-balanced, productive individuals, good family life, no drugs. None of them even smoked. I never saw any of them even light up a cigarette, and alcohol was just not happening. So it was evidence of the, on the behavioral level of the therapeutic effect of ayahuasca in this particular context, and that was very interesting. And what was also interesting was there was a sort of unexpected, yes, okay. I'm not going to go, I guess it doesn't cover it here, but so there was this behavioral response, and another interesting thing that we found was that from the platelet studies, we found that there was an upregulation of the serotonin transporters in these people. And this wasn't an acute effect, this was a long-term effect. This was after a washout period. So compared to age-matched controls, these folks had a higher level of serotonin transporters. in their platelets and presumably in their central nervous system. So upregulation, there was a neurochemical correlate to a behavioral response. It was almost too neat, but that is what we found. And what the implications of that are, I'm not sure. Ayahuasca is the only medicine that's been found that does this. So there's a lot of work to be done. And actually, after this study, we published about 8, come on, oops. Come on. Sorry. There we are. We published about 8 peer-reviewed publications between 1993 and 2000, reporting these findings, and then that sort of stimulated research interest in ayahuasca. This is a graph of the number of publications in PubMed starting in 1980, 1985, very few, but after our study, now there's 120 publications, peer-reviewed publications of ayahuasca. And if you go to PubMed and just put in ayahuasca, these will come up. How many of you know about PubMed? A good many of you, yes. Well, it's one good thing our government does. It's the open access biomedical database for whatever's going on in medicine. So if you're a physician or a health professional, you already know about it. It's a great resource, and you can find out what these things are. Okay. I don't want to go too far into this, but one of the main constituents of ayahuasca, as you know, is a beta-carboline alkaloid. Several beta-carbolines, but harmine is the main one. Harmine is a beta-carboline, and it's the main monoamine oxidase inhibitor in ayahuasca that prevents the peripheral degradation of DMT and allows it to be orally active. And harmine is a very interesting compound. For one thing, I like to call it a hoary old alkaloid, in the sense that it's been known for over 150 years. It actually was discovered originally in Paganum harmala, and this is why it's called harmine. It's named after the species name of Paganum harmala, the Syrian rue. Only later was it identified in ayahuasca. So we know that it's an MAO inhibitor, but it turns out there's been recent work that shows that it has a number of different activities that are very interesting. For one thing, it inhibits a kinase called DYRK1A, which has to do with neurogenesis. And actually, harmine blocks the action of DYRK1, which is a kinase that inhibits neurogenesis. So this is all in vitro work, but the implication is that for treatment of cognitive deficits and this sort of thing, it actually stimulates the growth of neurons in the hippocampus. So that's quite interesting. It also interacts with all these other receptors to some degree, including the dopamine transporter here. And it has all these other kinds of activities. And so the idea that ayahuasca has been figured out and there's nothing more to be learned from it, here's a 150-year-old alkaloid that has activities we never suspected. So there's a great deal to be discovered. And it has other effects that are not necessarily on the central nervous system. It inhibits MAO and various enzymes. It's light-activated intercalation into DNA. It has anti-tumor activity, antiviral activity, and of course anti-parasitic activity, which is one of the main reasons that ayahuasca is protective against parasites in the Amazon. Very useful to have ayahuasca around because everyone has parasites, or there are many parasites to worry about. Another paper that we published, Luis Eduardo Luna and I, after I did my degree, was called Biodynamic Constituents in Ayahuasca Admixtures. Ayahuasca is sort of the center of a pharmacopoeia of traditional ethnomedicines, not just ayahuasca itself and chacruna, but many other plants that are sometimes used in conjunction with it or used during the dietas, which are a process of if you're initiating, learning to use ayahuasca, you have to diet with these other plants. So we did a kind of a extensive literature search on these other associated plants, and found, interestingly, that the 52 genera that we looked at, 23% were considered hallucinogens in their own right, not as admixtures to ayahuasca. 6% had unknown constituents. So there's a great deal of unknown chemistry here that still remains to be done. And these plants resemble these plants are the ethnopharmacopoeia, if you will, of Amazonian traditional medicine. You can go to any herbalist stall in Iquitos or other parts of the Amazon and purchase these remedies, and some are associated with ayahuasca. This is where 80% of the world gets their medicines, and this is one reason why the World Health Organization has said that the preservation of this ethnomedical knowledge is so important, because if number one, they don't have access to pharmaceuticals, and number two, these medicines are important for public health, basically. So, and many of them come from, threatened environments. So in 2004, I was invited by an outfit called the Stanley Medical Research Foundation to look into some of these medicines as potential treatments for schizophrenia and cognitive deficits. And I talked to the guy, and I said, well, I haven't really done research in the Amazon for a long time. He more or less invited me to do this. He said, well, we gave away $240 million last year to support schizophrenia research. I said, well, where do I sign? I didn't get that much, but I did get $500,000, and that got me down there for the next 4 years. And what we did, it was all described in this film that we showed earlier. We used radioligand, we used receptor binding assays to make simple extracts of these many plants and screen them against about 80 different receptors. And the idea was to find a novel compound that had the right profile to do this treatment. Well, we didn't get there, but we did get some interesting results, which is shown here. I don't know if you can see it, but these are these are receptors on this axis. These are the percent inhibition of these extracts. So as you can see, these are the serotonin receptors, and there's a great deal of activity. It seems to be concentrated there. Another one, as I mentioned in the film, are the opiate receptors. They were very, very common that many of these plants hit opiate receptors, so for whatever that means. Here is an example of one of the plants that turned out to be most interesting. It's called Sananho, or sometimes Uchu Sanango. It's Tabernae montana species. And it has folk uses to treat, guess what, cognitive deficits. And we looked at these plants here were the sort of the ones that emerged from our study, of that were most of interest: Abuta, Needham, Tabernae montana, and so on. And so these are, again, folklorically very interesting. Chemically, practically unknown. Pharmacologically, they hit the right receptors, they have the right profile. So that all needs to be followed up. Okay, so that's kind of the summary of my own work, and I think this last one the rest of it will go more quickly, hopefully. So the question comes up, why bother? Why bother looking for psychoactive drugs? What is the value of the ethnopharmacologic search for psychoactive drugs? Is this just about finding new plants to get high on? Well, that's part of the agenda, But the real agenda is that this work actually has value. New psychoactive substances, whether they're natural or synthetic, novel structures can often point to novel pharmacological mechanisms and novel cellular and molecular targets. So then these molecules become scaffolds for drug discovery through medicinal chemistry and modifying these molecules. Sometimes they don't need modification. What's the consequences of that? Looking at their pharmacology can enhance our understanding of the neurochemical foundations of consciousness and the neuropathology of mental illness. So there is value here, and eventually these new compounds can lead to new therapeutic applications and better understanding of the nature of mind as well, which I think we're all interested in. So here's just a few significant discoveries in the last 50 years in ethnopharmacology. One of these, this is an interesting plant. It's in the Acanthaceae. It's called Teleostachya lanceolata, or Toé negro is the common name. It's very common. It's sometimes grown as a ground cover in Iquitos along the streets, very low to the ground. It's used as an additive to ayahuasca occasionally. It causes an intoxication that may last for 3 days, during which there is a conversation with the plant, as the shaman tells you, and it may also make you go blind for 3 days. So probably pretty dangerous, but worth investigating. And will I be investigating it? Probably not from the bioassay standpoint. You know, well, that's what graduate students are for, right? But I will be taking careful notes, you know, that somebody needs to look into this. The chemistry is completely unknown. The psychoactivity is well documented. What molecular discoveries are to be made there? Another one here, very interesting as well, vinho de Urema, which is the source of another orally active DMT-based preparation that's used in northeastern Brazil. It's called Urema, and the plant is Mimosa hostilis. Now, we know that Mimosa hostilis contains high levels of DMT. In fact, it's often substituted for chacruna, and it used to be that you could order a Mimosa hostilis root. Only 15 minutes? We're not even close to the end, I'm sorry. But we'll get there. Okay, don't worry, I'll go away. The puzzle about Mimosa hostilis is it's orally active. There's no MAO inhibitor that we know about. So how does it work? Well, recently, this interesting molecule was isolated from it, and that may be an MAO inhibitor in itself, or it may be a psychedelic in itself. We don't know. It's interesting how DMT is caged within this molecule. The chemists among you will recognize the structure of DMT there. So it's possible this is converted to DMT in the body. Nobody knows. There hasn't been enough, enough work on it. Not even enough has been isolated for anyone to bioassay it. But this may be the answer to the secret of Mimosa hostilis. Recently, the acacias have gotten a lot of attention. The Australian acacias are a huge genus. There are over 1,200 species of acacia, mostly from Australia. We know at least 100 species that contain enormous amounts of DMT. About 2% of the leaves of acacia, of these psychoactive acacias, are DMT. Ironically, in Australia, the acacias are known generically as wattles. The group is called wattles. Acacias are the national tree of Australia. All acacias are now illegal in Australia, which is kind of ironic. I'll try to move quickly through these. There's the toad shamanism, particularly Bufo ovarius, that contains high levels of 5-methoxy-DMT, and now smoking toad has become a kind of a popular thing. There's not a lot of evidence that there was traditional use, but there may have been. How many people here will admit to having smoked toad? right, good. It's very interesting. Salvia divinorum, here's another one. This was not talked about in the original one. It was known about, but there was no understanding of the pharmacology. In the interim, this interesting diterpene has been isolated, Salvinorin A. And unlike most psychoactive compounds, it contains no nitrogen, so it's like cannabinoids. And yet it is the most potent naturally occurring psychoactive substances so far isolated. It's active at around 50 micrograms, which is comparable to LSD. And not only that, but it is the most selective compound so far discovered for, it doesn't work on serotonin receptors, it works on the kappa opiate receptor, which there are 3 types, mu, delta, and kappa. Salvinorin A binds only to the kappa opiate receptor and nothing else. That is very unusual for any drug. The red blocks in front, that's LSD. LSD is a classically dirty drug, and it's dirty in the sense that it's not that selective for receptors. It hits mainly all these serotonin receptors, but also dopamine, norepinephrine, other receptors. So Salvinorin A, whether or not it ever yields anything therapeutic, is just interesting for pharmacology because there's no substance known that hits the kappa receptors that selectively and with such potency. So this has been looked at with medicinal chemistry, and this may have medicinal applications. It's not illegal yet. Probably some of you have experimented with it. I think one reason it's not illegal is that it's dysphoric. For most people, once is more than enough. So it's kind of a built-in protection against abuse. Here's another one, Kava, which is probably well known. Kava is a member of the pepper family, Piper methysticum. It's used as a recreational beverage throughout Polynesia, and it's not illegal. You can buy it as a supplement, and it's very nice. It produces a kind of a mellow intoxication like alcohol, except nobody gets aggressive, nobody's judgment is impaired, and they use it in traditional societies to talk story. That's what they call it. The men and the women chew the root, they spit it into these bowls, and then it's mixed up, and you drink it, and it's quite nice. It's rather an acquired taste, but if you get used to it, it's very pleasant. Again, this is another example where the active principles, so-called the kavapyrones, do not contain nitrogen. And some of them are muscle relaxants, some are anxiolytic, and some are euphoric. So there's euphoriants. So there's a spectrum of chemovars, which are selected for these different properties. And it has therapeutic uses, like this, anxiolytics, skeletal muscle relaxant, calmative, higher doses. It's a reliable sleep inducer. It may be useful for controlling seizures. It has neuroprotective properties in stroke. It's an analgesic. It does not work on opiate receptors. It's a local anesthetic, and it's a topical antifungal. So if you happen to have a fungal infection and are anxious, you can take Kava. Works on both. Of course, you all know about iboga and ibogaine, so I won't belabor this. This is an African plant in the Apocynaceae, and it is the source of, and it's used traditionally in the Bwiti initiation rites in Africa, Bwiti tribe. When young people, men and women, are ready to become adults, they chew copious amounts of iboga roots, and they have a 3-day experience in which they are visited by the ancestors. And the ancestors appear and lay down the principles of the tribe. And this is what you have to do if you want to become a good adult member of Bwiti society. Ibogaine is the major active alkaloid. It's not a psychedelic, but it hits a variety of receptors. And its primary therapeutic action is as in biomedicine is to treat addictions, particularly opiate addictions, for which it's effective, more or less. And there are lots of underground clinics. This is not approved yet, but it is probably going to get approval because its effectiveness, is incontrovertible, and we have an opiate crisis, in case you haven't noticed. Another one that might address this is Kratom, Mitragyna speciosa, in the coffee family, the Rubiaceae, used as a substitute often for opium in Southeast Asia and Africa. And it has a number of alkaloids, mitragynine, 7-hydroxymitragynine. Basically, they target the opiate receptors. This may be a kind of an herbal methadone. It's used in Southeast Asia for people who are addicted to opium or heroin. They take this to help taper off. Or sometimes they just take it because it does have opiate properties. Here's another one, Scaletium tortuosum, also called Kana, from South Africa. And this is another plant that's used traditionally that's actually, it has SSRI properties. It's both an anxiolytic and a stimulant. And it's legal. You can order this. There's a commercial product called Zembrin that's quite nice. It helps relieve anxiety and depression. So that's one. I'll have to move quickly and then mention the frogs again and the Cambo medicine, which is Philomedusa. This is the frog medicine where you have to torture the frog to get the venom, and then they put it into, burn themselves with a cigarette and rub the venom in, and it produces a violent, immediate interaction and involving usually a total collapse of your whole system. Why people want to do this puzzles me, but I don't know. Anyway, so what else is left? What else is out there? Well, it turns out a lot of things. Where are we at, Charles? How long? 10 minutes? Oh, no problem. Okay, great. Great. Well, here's an interesting story. So we know about the psilocybin mushrooms, and how many of you you're familiar with Boletus? It's considered one of the more delicious genera, and you can find it around here. By the time you find them, they're usually full of worms, but if you happen to get a fresh Boletus, they're really good. Turns out in China, there are a couple of species, I should maybe put it on the screen, a couple of species that are definitely psychoactive and hallucinogenic. It's called the chow ren ren mushroom in Chinese. I'm probably saying that wrong, but it means the little person. And when you take this, you see little people everywhere. And the Chinese don't recognize this as a drug thing. If you go to the marketplaces in Yunnan, where these mushrooms are native, they sort of get giggly and they smile and they say, oh, I'm not going to tell the Westerner all about this, but they know about it, right? Interestingly, it's not always active. So I had a friend that really wanted to go after this. He and his friend, he speaks Chinese. He went to the marketplace during the mushroom season, took every damn Boletus he could lay his hands on, and had absolutely no effect. So there's something going on, that it is certain species, maybe it has more certain environments they grow on, it's not clear, but the activity is definitely there. It's probably not psilocybin. So, in fact, the descriptions are it's not psilocybin. Another very interesting area for drug discovery is psychedelic or psychotropic fish. They're so-called dream fish, and there are a number of them, as you can see. This is one that was recently reported, this Sternoptus, and the Arabic name for it means the fish that makes dreams. The common name is the Salima porgi. And this is another fish. When you consume it, it is sometimes active and often not, which indicates that it's probably something the fish is eating, maybe a phytoplankton phytoplankton during a certain part of the season. But it was used recreationally by the Romans and also ceremonially by the Polynesians. So there are reports of that. The effects are, I'm not sure why they used it, because the effects are it causes an LSD-like response, but it lasts 3 days. And you see demonic hallucinations, sometimes quite terrifying. One person reported seeing 30-foot tall arachnids that were attacking his car as he tried to drive along. But, you know, some people have a weird idea of a good time. But this is an interesting thing in the ethnopharmacology. I mean, it's not even ethno, but it's an interesting thing because it's like LSD, but we don't know anything like this that lasts 3 days. This is very, very likely to have a novel molecule, and it's worth going after, I think. And of course, nobody will, or maybe somebody will. Maybe I will. I don't know. If I get money, I'll do it. But this is an interesting thing. Also, psychotropic insects. I'm going to rip through this rather quickly. There's one that we know that's quite interesting. It's the larva of this moth, which is found in sugarcane waste in Brazil. The larva is psychotropic. The moth, it's not so clear, but this was reported by the French explorer Saint-Hilaire, and it was consumed by the Malalas Indians, which is a tribe native to the Brazilian province of Minas Gerais. When the intestinal parts are eaten, it induces fantastic dreams lasting more than a day. Needless to say, there's no chemistry, no investigation of this. Another very interesting area for discovery of new molecules. You might have gathered that I'm interested in new molecules, and I actually love these structures. I think they're kind of beautiful. But fungal endophytes are an area that is not well investigated, and they're just, fungal endophytes are fungi that live inside of plants, but they're not pathogens, they're symbiotes. They live inside of plants, and they often have very interesting compounds in them, and this is practically untouched in terms of scientific investigation. Many of the fungal endophytes that are already been looked at contain ergolines, which are lysergic acid derivatives. So this particular one here that is shown is Achnatharum inebriums, and is the scientific name, which means drunken horse grass. And it's not a grass, it's a sedge, but it grows in China, and it contains, you know, these interesting compounds, which are all related to LSD. Some of them are quite toxic. Some of them are probably psychoactive. That would indicate by the name that there's psychoactivity here. So, you know, there's a vast area of chemical diversity. Someone needs to systematically start looking into these endophytes. Virtually all plants have endophytes, but particularly the woody plants. So there's a whole, you know, there's decades of work to be done. So this is the sunset on the Rio Ampayaku, which is where I did part of the work for my graduate thesis, where we went looking for the ukuhe that I told you. The Rio Ampayaku means the river of poisons. And because the people there are famous for a particular arrow poison that they make that's quite potent. This is where Zara accompanied our group, and when we were in the process of looking for these things, you can see her there. She was in the process of going native, but you know, we managed to extract her out, and now she lives in New York and works for Discovery Channel, and she has a husband and 2 lovely daughters and lives quite a normal life. But it was great to work with her, and also Aku, as he was known, who was our guide, and also an amazing character from Iquitos, a guide and all around, you know, wild man, lovely man, and passed away a few years ago. So our trip up the Ampiyaku, the River of Poisons, resulted in this movie which you saw before. So that's it. Thank you. Wow, nice, thanks.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Let's have another round of applause for Dennis.
Thanks.
Okay, we're going to get started with the Q&A, and this gentleman's patiently meeting me out here.
I have to caution you on the Q&A. I'm deaf as a post, actually. My wife never fails to remind me. So I do have hearing aids, but you do have to speak strongly and not yell, but speak clearly.
Thank you so much, Dennis. I actually had a question about harmine.
Okay.
I've been doing research. I'm a type 1 diabetic, and I found recently that it has been used quite a bit as a potential reversal of early stage type 1 diabetes. And I'm actually curious if there's any folkloric or ethnographic history that you're aware of it being used in tribes for treatment of diabetes.
It's used for the reversal of what?
Type 1 diabetes.
Type 1 diabetes.
It's used for the reversal of type 1 diabetes. I am, in folk medicine, right?
It's in early stage research right now.
Really? Yeah, I have heard that. I can't tell you much more about it except that I have heard that. So that's interesting. Another interesting thing about harmine was that back in the 30s, when it was one of its earliest clinical uses was for Parkinson's. And it came on about the time that the drugs that we use now, L-DOPA, and those things were being discovered. But Louis Lewin, who is a famous psychopharmacologist, isolated harmine, which he called telepathy, I believe, or banisterine. And interestingly, harmine has been isolated several times under different names from different plants, but he gave this alkaloid, which he called banisterine, which turned out to be harmine, to his friend Kurt Beringer, who was a pharmacologist. He gave it to Parkinson's patients with very good initial results. And the drug was sort of put on the shelf, and they never went anywhere with it because the other ones were being developed. So that's kind of an interesting part of history of harmine. That you could make a whole career out of harmine. Just there's a lot, and all these beta carbolines is an unexplored area of natural products chemistry. So I'm not surprised to hear about the diabetic effect.
Next question is in the center.
Hi. So the cultivation of ibogaine, iboga, is a big problem because it's a slow-growing plant and it's becoming very popular and creating a shortage so that the native people who are used to being able to use it are not able to, and there really isn't enough. But so my question was, I have heard that there's another plant that also lives in that same area in West Africa, and that it's possible to synthesize ibogaine out of that plant, and I wanted to know if you knew anything about that.
Yes.
Okay.
There is another plant, and you're right, there is a shortage of ibogaine because it's over-harvested. It's actually illegal to export it out of Cameroon and Gabon, where it's native, but that doesn't matter. I mean, they pay as much attention to that as they do to over-harvesting elephants and this sort of thing. So it's being over-harvested. There is a shortage. It actually has been declared a endangered plant. And ICERS, the organization that I mentioned before, this is one of the things they're trying to address, how to develop sustainable sources of ibogaine. problem is the plant takes about 7 years before you can harvest it. You have to grow it 7 years. So that really, that puts a problem. To your question, though, there is a plant called Voacanga africana that is not endangered, grows in the same area, that contains a similar molecule. You can turn that into ibogaine in a couple of steps. So that can be used. That's the the source of pure ibogaine. Ibogaine hydrochloride. If they're using it clinically, chances are it's coming from that plant. It's identical to ibogaine from iboga, but the other alkaloids in Voacanga are not the same. And a lot of therapists that use ibogaine have told me they actually prefer the whole alkaloid fraction. It has a better therapeutic profile, and that's a problem because you're not going to get that from Voacanga. You really have to have the iboga. So a couple of years ago, I was involved in a project to try to develop a biotechnology for this called hairy root propagation. It's a way to grow iboga roots in vats, essentially, in vitro, in large bioreactors, and a genetic modification to boost the production of ibogaine. But that project didn't get very far. It's for complicated reasons. Number one was not enough money, but number two was very difficult regulatory issues around applying that kind of technology, because it would have been a genetically modified plant for sure, producing a controlled substance. So, you can imagine the regulatory mess that you'd have to navigate if you're going to produce it that way. It's still possible. It may happen, but I'm not too confident. And it's unfortunate because ibogaine shows a lot of promise. And who knows? At least you can use Voacanga to get the pure compound.
Next question's in the center.
Do you know of any promising research in regards to these kind of plant medicines and treatment of cancer?
In the treatment of cancer, some of the psychoactives, could you clarify what he said?
The basic question was whether there's anything in the ethnobotany category that is being used to treat cancer that you're aware of.
Oh, yeah. Hundreds. In folk use, hundreds of plants are used to treat cancer. Who knows if they're effective? Some of them probably are, but also the National Cancer Institute has had for years a natural products discovery program to find new compounds to treat cancer, and some of the, two major cancer medicines have come out of that. One is vincristine, which is from the Madagascar periwinkle. The other one is Taxol from the Pacific yew. Both of these are like major cancer drugs, and they came out of the natural products program. And they had a screening program, which I think is still going on. If you want to look at sort of drug discovery from natural products and how to do that, read up about the NCI's natural products program. They have figured out how to screen hundreds, if not thousands, of plants, but their focus is on cancer, not psychoactivity, unfortunately.
Next question is on your right.
Excuse me?
Next question is over on your right. Over here.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think.
Hi, I'm over here. Other way. Keep turning.
Okay.
Other way. Hey, over here. I guess
I can't see.
You're other right.
Not
Hey,
only can
know,
I
and
not
it's
hear,
impossible
I can't
with the-
see. Okay, there you are.
No, for sure. And I'm in the corner. Hello. Hi. Thank you very much for your talk. You mentioned earlier that a huge amount of pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical potential come from these plants, and the knowledge of which, and a lot of the knowledge that you've gained has come from indigenous peoples and has an effect on genetic diversity. What efforts do you know what efforts are being made to help potentially return some of the profits being made from drugs to those communities and to preserve genetic diversity?
Very little. Pharmaceutical companies in general, they're not, they're interested in making money, and they don't really acknowledge, as a rule, their debt to indigenous people, and this has been going on for years. I mean, it's called biopiracy, basically, and you can look at a lot of indigenous medicines, not only medicines, foods, everything else that, the so-called developed world has taken from the traditional world. It's becoming a problem because, well, for one thing, it's an inhibition to drug discovery. I mean, indigenous people are now finding that they've been essentially taken advantage of. This knowledge has been co-opted and appropriated by the pharmaceutical industry, which has very little interest in giving anything back. So indigenous people, I mean, they're smart too, and they're able to, hire their own lawyers and that sort of thing. So there's a whole area of regulatory law, you might say, that's related to this. And we need to find better models so that the people that are kind of preserving this knowledge get something back. If you invent $1 billion drug that comes from one of these sources, they should give something back. And but it's tricky because now they have, and the governments in these biodiverse countries like Brazil are saying, you don't get access to this anymore because you've been ripping us off. And so how do you negotiate a relationship that allows the science to go forward and actually give some benefit eventually to the people? It has been done. I mean, there are models for this. And actually, unexpectedly, the National Cancer Institute, again, because they've been going at this for so long, since basically the beginning of the 60s, they've worked this out, and they have figured out ways to collaborate with governments, collaborate with indigenous people in ways that respect this knowledge. And, so if we want to, I mean, you wouldn't expect this of a government agency, but they've worked it out. So there are ways to do it. The problem is that the environments, the species, and the knowledge is disappearing very rapidly. We're cutting down the rainforest so fast. There are literally trillions of dollars worth of drugs to be discovered in these high biodiversity environments, but there's no systematic effort to do that.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions. The next question is here in the center.
Could you tell us about the center that you're starting in Peru? A little bit about it?
No.
Oh.
Stay tuned.
Is there another question out here? Down front.
Could you please tell us what is next for you, what excites you, what you're doing with the Hefner Institute? What are you looking forward to now?
I have to refer to the previous question. Well, there's a lot to be done. I'm still excited about ethnopharmacology. I think it's more promising than ever. There's a lot of discoveries to be made. I'm also excited, obviously, about psychedelics, or I wouldn't be here. And I guess, as I look ahead, what I'd like to see, I'm a little concerned that psychedelics and medicine, the directions seem to be bifurcating. And on the one hand, you've got the push to develop something like psilocybin as a pharmaceutical, with all the problems that creates, because pharmaceutical companies, they want ownership, and they want ownership because they want to make money. But I think, there needs to be pushback against that. There needs to be some people that stand up and say, well, look, these are the people's medicine. They've always belonged to the people. How do we find a regulatory structure that will let ordinary people have access to it, that that are not prescription drugs and that are not owned by pharmaceutical companies. So that's a regulatory front and a front for activism that we really need to address. And if your inclination is toward lawyerly things, and the law and all this is a good place to put your effort. I mean, I personally have a few biases. I think that, one approach to this could be you could simply make a distinction between plants and drugs. This might be a place to start. Plants are not drugs, and it should be emphasized that persons, I'm a biologist, and I think the use of these plants, whether as food or drugs or anything we might use them for, is an example of symbiosis. That's beneficial relationships between different species. That's what it means in biology, and we should be part of that conversation, and we should emphasize people have a fundamental human right to form a symbiotic relationship with any damn plant they want. And I think we have to, stridently make that point. And, the people that are developing psilocybin as a pharmaceutical, more power to them, and yet there seems to be, I'm happy to see psilocybin come into the clinic, but the people that are putting the money up and, and fundamentally supporting this are not the most ethically advanced people in the world. And, so there's a problem. But I think this is an area for psychoactivism, if you want to say, to, make this point and say, what about the people? How do you get these plants to the people in ways that are, not profit-oriented necessarily and that are beneficial? And we have models for that. The ways that herbal medicines are, they're lightly regulated, but they are regulated, and something along those lines could be applied to some of these psychoactive plants. And ultimately, I think the natural compounds, the mushrooms are probably as good as, or even better than, the synthetic compounds for therapy. So, that's an interesting area. It'll be very interesting to see what happens as psilocybin advances in this direction. Is there any other alternative direction that might happen? What I'd like to see happen is, something like create centers, because there does, these are not drugs where you can say, just take 2 and call me in the morning. These things need to be taken under guidance. And so the shamanic model does provide a model for this. And it'll be interesting to see how all this unfolds in the next 5 to 10 years. But very good question. How do we do that?
Last audience questions over here.
Yeah, I know you have an intimate relationship with the Amazonian people and the culture and everything going on down there. I know Jonathan Ott also is deeply connected. I'm wondering if you have any collaboration with Jonathan Ott in going forward with any of these initiatives.
You have to repeat that.
The question was, do you have a relationship with Jonathan Ott in your various work?
With Jonathan Ott or who?
Jonathan Ott, period.
Well, I have a relationship with him. He's a hermit. He's very much under the radar. I hear from him maybe once every 5 years or so. I run into him, but he spends a lot of time, I don't know where, under a rock or something. He's not exactly out there on the circuit. He's a wonderful, very knowledgeable guy, but he doesn't rarely comes to conferences like this. I tried to invite him to this conference, the Ethnopharmacologic Search, and I never got a response back from him. So I assume he's out there, but I don't know. He's certainly one of the key figures in all this, and his book Pharmacotheon is a landmark in the field. So, do you know where he is? Or?
Well, let's move on. Moderator's privilege for the summary question. You go everywhere. You see every psychedelic community in the world.
That's true.
What do they look like, and what do you want those of us in those communities to be doing to push this work forward?
Well, it's true. I travel a lot over the world. I come to conferences like this in the States and in foreign countries. And the thing that impresses me about this is how similar these associations are. No matter what country, it's led by young people who are passionate and really insightful usually. I mean, I got to tell you, I have great respect for millennials because they're bringing a lot of wisdom to this and, good hearts and good minds. And it's not just millennials. I see there's a few geezers here like myself. But, it's the young people that are going to make the difference. And when I go to these conferences, I'm actually impressed in a positive way by how similar they are. I mean, it's like a global meme, and whether it's Australia or Prague or Estonia or Arizona or wherever these conferences are, it's a very similar kind of thing. So I feel like we're all getting the message in a certain way, and I often say in my lectures, remember, we're not running this show. The plants are running this show, and we're all working for the plants. I feel like I work for the plants. I feel like the plants work me a little too hard sometimes, but it's good work, and we all share in this. It's really the plants that are leading this. So. It's a global phenomenon, not just in the West, and so that's got to be a good thing because this is happening on a species level, and I think one thing we're learning about psychedelics, and now you get me off, I'll be another hour and a half raving about this, but I think what the plants are teaching us in an important way is that we are facing a crisis on this planet, and the plants are catalysts for changing consciousness. They're a way to make us re-understand and reappraise our relationship to nature, and this is what has to happen because we're busy killing nature. And, the policies of our government and many governments, particularly ours, are mostly very destructive. I mean, any government that that passes laws that roll back, curbs against carbon emission and this sort of thing, even as ineffective as those things are, this is the wrong direction. We've got to wake up as a species, and plants are one way to do this. These plant medicines are waking people up. Question is, are they doing it quick enough, and are they waking enough people up to really tip the balance? And so I think this is part of the phenomenon. These educational conferences like this is a manifestation of that. So just listen to your medicines and do what they tell you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.